Good evening. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle, and we're pleased to present live from the front lines in the fight for the right to vote, a conversation with journalist Ari Berman. Thank you for joining us tonight. Right now, hundreds of bills to restrict voting rights are moving through state legislatures. Some have already been signed into law. Debate on the comprehensive democracy bill that would counter many of the voter suppression laws, the For the People Act, was filibustered by Republicans. And the Supreme Court's 6-3 decision in Brnovich versus DNC weakened Article 2 of the Voting Rights Act to make it harder to challenge discriminatory voting laws in court. Together, all of us here can and must stand up for democracy and the right to vote for all Americans. The critical fight for voter rights is front and center for us at the Workers' Circle. We're a social justice organization that builds progressive Jewish identity through Jewish culture, Yiddish language, multi-generational education, and altogether, we act collectively in campaigns for economic justice, immigrant and voter rights, and as a partner in the national movement to end systemic racism in the United States. Tonight's program features a conversation between journalist Ari Berman and the Workers' Circle Director of Social Justice, Noel D'Amico. There will be time for Q&A from the audience via the Q&A feature in Zoom and the comments on Facebook. At the conclusion of the program, we will announce 5 winners of a raffle for Ari's book, Give Us the Ballot. Everyone who is present is automatically entered. Immediately following the program at 8 p.m., you'll have the opportunity to stay on to make your voice heard for voting rights as we call our senators in support of the passage of the For the People Act. The Workers' Circle is grateful to our many co-sponsors of tonight's program. Whether you're on the Zoom, watching Facebook Live, or seeing the recording, we're very glad you're here. And now I would like to introduce Noel D'Amico, my colleague.
Thank you, Anne. We are so pleased to have Ari Berman back with us tonight at this crucial hour for our democracy. Ari is a senior reporter at Mother Jones covering voting rights. His stories have also appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, Politico, and The Guardian. He's a frequent guest and political commentator on MSNBC, NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. Ari's work has earned him an Izzy Award for outstanding achievement in independent media and a place on the FD 200 awardees whose work embodies Frederick Douglass's enduring legacy of social change. Ari's the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America, which was a finalist for the National Book Critic Circle Award for Nonfiction. He's also the author of Herding Donkeys, The Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party and Reshape American Politics, as well as the author of the forthcoming Minority Rule, about efforts by white conservatives to entrench power in the face of a massive demographic and political shift. Welcome, Ari.
Hey, Noel, great to see you. And thank you so much to Anne and the Workers' Circle and all the great voting rights groups that are co-sponsoring this.
Thanks. You couldn't be with us at a better time. Let's start with the hundreds of state bills to restrict voting rights that have been introduced since the 2020 election, some of which, of course, have already been signed into law. Now, for some Americans, it's like waking up at a quarter to midnight, wondering bleary-eyed, how did it all get so bad so fast? But for other Americans who've really been experiencing voter purges, new ID laws, shifting polling places, and huge lines for years now, it looks more like an acceleration of attacks that have been underway for a while. Ari, you've been on the front lines reporting. Is the sheer magnitude of this onslaught on voting rights at the state level a surprise for you? Tell us what generated the speed and the ferocity of this wave of new state laws to restrict voting rights.
Yeah, I think that's right, Noel. I think the magnitude of the attack on voting rights is what is new. The substance is not new because I've been covering this issue for a decade. And of course, voter suppression goes back a long time in American history. But just the fact that already this year, 17 states have passed nearly 30 new laws, making it harder to vote. That's the highest number of bills restricting the right to vote since the end of Reconstruction, leading into the Jim Crow era. And I think what makes this different than attacks on voting rights that we might have seen in 2018 or 2019 was it followed an attempt to try to overturn an election. And that really was unprecedented. And far from there being a course correction after the insurrection, this is now an attempt to try to weaponize the insurrection and to try to succeed through other means, that because trying to overturn the election failed, they are now trying to rig future elections in advance and do it in a quote unquote legal way. So it doesn't seem like you're overturning an election, or it doesn't seem like you are flagrantly overturning the will of the voters, but it's having the same kind of substance. So for me, I wasn't surprised because I believed all along this was why so many Republicans refused to denounce Trump's big lie, because they knew it would be useful for them in the future. But I was still taken aback just by the sheer magnitude and how quickly things move through the legislative sessions, and also just how similar so many of the pieces of legislation have been.
Can you take us through some of these bills? There have been so many of them. Many of us have heard of some of the bills that have passed in Georgia, but may be unaware of others. What are these bills? What are these laws in some cases? And who are they targeting?
Well, I think Georgia was really the template for them, because what Georgia did is it didn't attack one voting method or another voting method. I mean, there's 16 different provisions in the Georgia law that make it harder to vote in lots of different ways, from preventing election officials to sending out mail ballot request forms, to dramatically closing the number of mail ballot drop boxes, to allowing unlimited challenges from right-wing groups to voter eligibility, to expanding access to partisan poll watchers, to adding new ID requirements, to stripping the Secretary of State, a Republican, from power and a member of the state election board, to allowing the state election board to take over county election boards. I mean, This is really sweeping. And I think, again, that's what's different about things that happened in years past. In years past, I might have been covering one voter ID law here or cutbacks to early voting here. But this was clearly a flood the zone strategy to include so many different provisions, making it harder to vote, that it would be really hard, number one, for the voters to understand it, but number two, to try to fight back against it. Because once you felt like you killed one aspect of the bill, there was a whole nother aspect of the bill that you might not even realize until it actually passed. And it was very difficult for those of us who were journalists to try to follow this process all the way through, because the bills kept changing. There were so many provisions to them. They were so lengthy, and often they were so rushed that you didn't even know what was happening until it had actually been codified into law. So I think that really set the blueprint, because then a lot of other states, were Florida, places like that, were doing similar kind of things. I think there's a misnomer in a lot of ways. First off, a lot of people think this is about voter ID. Most of these bills have nothing to do with voter ID. They go way beyond that. Secondly, there's a misnomer. This is all about mail voting. A lot of these bills go way beyond mail voting. Montana got rid of election day registration. That has nothing to do with mail voting. Lots of states expanded access for partisan poll watchers. That has nothing to do with mail voting. Texas, in the process, Georgia, Arkansas included provisions making it easier to overturn elections. That has nothing to do with mail voting. So this was an attack on every stage of the election process. And I think clearly what they're trying to do is they're trying to dissuade new voters, younger voters, voters of color, historically disenfranchised populations from participating at the same rate in the future. Because I think the big story about all of this is that we had the highest turnout in 120 years in 2020. And that very well could have become the new normal. We could have said every state should have mail voting, every state should have early voting, every state should have traditional in-person voting. Let's do all three and give people as many options as possible. It worked really well in a pandemic. We can do it in normal times as well. Instead, states have been chipping back on those kind of options to vote. And I think that's really, really unfortunate, because there was a case to be made that both parties did pretty well with high turnout, and we could have had elections look like that in the future.
Frankly, it's shameful. The idea that at this moment, when we know more and we have the capacity to make more people's voices heard, that states are actually moving to restrict voting rights at this time. Ari, a lot of these laws to people can sound neutral, on their face, but they function to target voters of color frequently. Can you give us an example of how some of these laws or provisions within a larger bill work?
Yeah, I'll give you a really good example. Montana got rid of election day registration, which is your ability to register and vote on the same day. That probably more than any other thing leads to increased voter turnout, because a lot of people don't register in time for deadlines. Remember, a lot of states cut off voting and registration 30 days before an election. So you could be watching a presidential debate in mid-October, but you can't register to vote anymore in Ohio or Georgia, a place like that. So Montana had election day registration. Well, a lot of Native Americans in Montana live on reservations where they have to travel 60 miles one way to be able to vote. So the ability to register and vote at the same time is really, really useful for them, because it's really hard to make a 120-mile trip from a reservation to register and then go back and do it to vote. So the convenience of having both of them together clearly increases voter turnout. Same thing for college students. A lot of people don't pay attention until right before the election. Election registration allows them to do that. Montana got rid of that. On the face of it, it applies equally to all voters, right? All voters can take advantage of it. In practice, it's going to have a major disproportionate effect on younger voters and Native American voters. Another example, in Georgia, they tried to cut Sunday voting. In Texas, they almost passed a bill cutting Sunday voting. Again, Sunday voting seems like it's the kind of thing that anybody could do, and it's true. Anyone could vote on Sunday. Well, it just so happens that Black churches hold souls to the polls voter mobilization drives on Sundays. And there's clear evidence that Blacks are more likely to vote on Sundays than other days of the week. Again, it looks perfectly race neutral. I'm sure to Samuel Alito, it is race neutral. But if you look at the actual effect, it's clearly targeted at groups that are more likely to vote on Sundays, AKA Black voters. So there's a lot of parts of this that I think, number one, sound reasonable, and number two, seem like they equally apply to all voters. But it's only when you dig in to who uses these kind of voting methods that you start to realize that they fall disproportionately on certain groups when you get rid of them.
So of course, couching racist policies in neutral language is nothing new for politicians or even for the courts. tell us, is this the same playbook that's been used in the past? Is anything different?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's really interesting. I've gone back and looked a lot at the voting restrictions that were passed at the end of Reconstruction, the beginning of Jim Crow. And the authors of those bills were very openly racist, that they didn't want Black people to vote. But the legislation itself never mentioned race. So in Mississippi, they said they wanted to disenfranchise Black voters, but there was nothing inherently racist about a literacy test or a poll tax according to the law itself, which then gave the Supreme Court an opening to uphold it and say, listen, it might have a disproportionate effect on Black voters. They may even have said that that was what it was intended to do, but the law itself doesn't say that. Therefore, we don't believe it's racist. And I think a lot of that is happening right now. And I also think there's been a rebranding of efforts to make it harder to vote. Remember, for years, the justification for these bills was voter fraud, that there was widespread voter fraud, that we needed to pass these laws, new voter ID laws, et cetera, to try to counteract. Well, the issue of voter fraud was litigated more extensively in 2020 than in any previous election. You had Republicans in states like Georgia say there was no fraud. So they couldn't really use that argument anymore because you had 60 courts say there was no fraud. So basically, they shifted from the voter fraud argument to the election integrity argument, that they weren't alleging mass fraud. They were just trying to prevent that kind of thing from happening in the future. And who could be against election integrity? And of course, all of us are for election integrity. But I think what we learned in 2020 was there's no trade-off between access and security. That's how it's been marketed, that Republicans believe in security, Democrats believe in access. Well, in fact, we had the highest turnout in 120 years, and the Trump administration said it was the most secure election ever. So we had both, and that's really crucial going forward, that we can have access, we can have security at the same time. Therefore, they had to shift to this argument in favor of election integrity. And of course, the fact that they lied and then people believe those lies then laid the groundwork and gave them the predicate to be able to do this. Say, all we're doing is responding to the views of our constituents without acknowledging that they were responsible for the fact that their constituents believed so many things that weren't true.
We're going to pick up that thread of voter fraud and election fraud and how that myth has been continued and perpetuated. We'll come back to that a little later on. What I want to look at with you right now is how the laws that are being passed or are in play in Republican-led states are targeting likely Democratic voters. I'm curious, how is race a stand-in for party and vice versa? Can one use younger voters or physically challenged voters as a stand-in for party in the same way?
Well, you look at Georgia, for example. In Georgia, it was Republicans that pushed for no excuse absentee voting. It was Republicans that exempted mail ballots from voter ID laws when they passed the voter ID law for in-person voting. It was Republicans that encouraged their constituents to vote by mail because they were elderly and more rural and had a harder time getting to the polls. And it was only after the Black share of mail voting increased and the white share of mail voting decreased that they tried to repeal no excuse absentee voting. They cut the number of mail ballot drop boxes. They added new ID requirements for mail voting. So, I mean, if white people had just been voting by mail like it had been in the past, there would have been no changes to mail voting. Same thing happened in Florida, same thing happened in Arizona. I mean, so this was clearly motivated by race. And I think we're at a time where how can you de-link race and party when 90% of African Americans are voting for Democrats, a majority of Hispanics, a majority of Asian Americans? I mean, the Democratic Party is a multiracial party, and the Republican Party is an almost entirely white party. And of course, there's some exceptions to that rule. There obviously are white Democrats, and there obviously are Black and brown Republicans, but by and large, the Democratic Party is a far more diverse coalition. And so that's why I think it's really a mistake to say this was done for race or this was done for party. I think you have to look at who is affected by these things. And it's clear that they are going after the voting methods that was used to increase voter turnout. I mean, this was an election where voter turnout increased among all different races, all different demographic groups. But you look at the fact that it's being made harder to register to vote. That's clearly targeting new voters. You look at the fact that they are rolling back things like election day registration, like early voting that was used to increase voter turnout. They're adding new requirements to voting methods only after they were used by certain demographic groups. So I think there's a lot of different ways in which these things target certain communities. And you just look at some of the data in the lawsuit that the Justice Department filed against the state of Georgia. They noted, for example, that they cut the number of mail ballot drop boxes in Metro Atlanta from about 120 mail ballot drop boxes in 2020 to there's going to be only about 20 now in those counties. I mean, those are the counties with the highest percentage of Black voters. And so, I mean, there's not going to be a reduction from 120 to 20 mail ballot drop boxes in rural white counties because they only had 1 or 2 drop boxes to begin with. And so, I mean, there's clear on a lot of different levels, there's a disproportionate impact in terms of people's ability to vote.
Let me ask a little more about younger voters, those college students that are out that, how is that playing into some of these laws?
Well, I mean, there's efforts to try to purge younger voters from the voter rolls. There's efforts like in Texas, you already can vote with a gun permit, but not a student ID. Montana did a similar thing where they no longer would allow student IDs as a valid form of ID, things like that. Young people benefit from more voting options. In general, they like to do things in the most convenient kind of way. So when you let them know, hey, you can vote by mail, you can vote early, you can vote on person on election day, that helps get them to the polls. If you tell them you only have 7 days to vote or 1 day to vote, as in the case of states that don't have early voting, and there might be long lines and there might be new ID requirements. And oh, by the way, last election you were automatically sent a mail ballot or you were automatically sent an absentee ballot request form. Now you can't do that anymore. Or now election officials are prevented from even sending that kind of information out. That's going to dissuade them from participating. And I do think that one of the reasons why 2020 was the first election in American history where a majority of people under 30 voted, which is a remarkable stat. I mean, it just shows how much we're failing at a democracy that wasn't that case in every election. But it's also true that youth turnout was up more than any other demographic group. And I think that was because so many states expanded voting options. And there was so much work by all the groups on this call to make sure that people knew that their vote would count. And I think that now there's questions about how much access people have and also will their votes be counted. And so there's questions about both of the things that I believe contributed to such high turnout in 2020.
Thanks. Ari, you've broken a really important story together with your colleague at Mother Jones, Nick Sergi. That story about how the Heritage Foundation was funding the creation of many of these state laws to restrict voting rights. Tell us a little bit more about the power and money driving these new state laws.
Yeah, this was a big question I had, which is how are so many states passing similar pieces of legislation in such a short period of time? And I knew someone had to be coordinating all of this because this doesn't just happen in state after state after state. And we obtained a leaked video from a big donor meeting of the Heritage Foundation, in which both the Heritage Foundation, which is the leading right-wing think tank in Washington, and their sister group, Heritage Action for America, which is kind of their political arm, were talking very openly about how they wrote what they called model legislation, making it harder to vote. And they talked very specifically about specific provisions that they wanted passed. They said, we wrote 8 provisions of the Georgia law, 19 provisions of the Texas bill, 3 provisions of the Iowa law. So there's a lot of specificity in terms of what they were saying they were doing. And if you looked at Heritage's list of what they called best practices, I mean, it was exactly the same as Trump's grievances about the election. It was nobody should be able to vote by mail unless they have an excuse to do so, or everyone should vote on election day. There should be no early voting, or partisan poll watchers should be able to do whatever they want with no limits. I mean, like it was a completely radical blueprint that would take you back to the 1950s in terms of voting access. And they were trying to implement this in state after state after state, and they weren't, altogether successful in fully repealing no excuse absentee voting or doing things like that, because those things are very popular now. But they were very influential in, making it harder to vote by mail, or reducing options to return a mail ballot, or expanding access for partisan poll watchers. All these things that we have seen in Georgia and Texas and Florida and Iowa and all these places. And The fact that there were some quotes in that video where Jessica Anderson, who's the executive director of Heritage Action for America, said, we did it quietly, we did it quickly. Nobody even noticed. And they were basically kind of cheering on these efforts to make it harder to vote. I think it struck a lot of people as really distasteful. And then the other thing that I think was so newsworthy about it is you had a dark money group that doesn't have to disclose its donors. I mean, Heritage Action raised $11 million in 2019. The Heritage Foundation raised $122 million in 2019. We don't know virtually any of those donors. We know they were speaking to their donors, but we don't actually know who their donors were. And then we have no way to find out. I mean, no legal way for us to go through the records and find out. Funding voter suppression. And, when a lot of Senate Democrats picked up on the story, they pointed out that the For the People Act was designed to stop very much that, the connection between dark money and voter suppression. And people say, why does the For the People Act deal with voting rights and money? Well, because those two things are connected. And it makes sense that they're connected because the same people that want to buy elections want to make it harder to vote in them, to try to concentrate power in fewer and fewer hands. And so to me, it was just really an illustration of how our democracy got so broken and the groups that are really working to push this. And it was also very clear that this was not an organic bottom-up strategy that it originated in the States. This was a Washington, D.C. centric voter suppression strategy that had been exported to the States by people that had been trying to make it harder to vote for decades already.
Exactly. And when you can't suppress the votes, then, well, let's gerrymander instead, which is the other big bucket in the For the People Act. We'll be getting to the For the People Act soon. I want to go back and return to what you raised, the really important false claim of election and voter fraud, a lie that's been propagated by not only former President Trump, but also members of Congress, state elected officials, and even the Supreme Court. Some of these state bills, Ari, would give elected officials the ability to overturn legitimate election results. That to me it's mind-boggling. Can you tell us about these bills?
Yeah, that's probably the most disturbing part of all of this because that's the ultimate voter suppression. It's just throwing out people's votes altogether. I think the restrictions on voting are to tinker around the edges in terms of making it harder to vote. But if you just throw out all the votes for one candidate, that is a dramatically higher level of voter suppression to which there really is no recourse. You can't out-organize having your vote thrown out. So to me, that's the ultimate backstop, the most anti-democratic part of all of this, the most direct consequence of Trump's big lie. That's what Trump wanted to do. He asked the Supreme Court to throw out tens of millions of votes. Even the Supreme Court was unwilling to go along with that. So now they're trying to change the law to try to achieve the same kind of outcome. And so in Georgia, for example, the Secretary of State who stands up to Trump and says the election was secure, he's no longer a voting member of the state election board. Instead, the gerrymandered legislature in Georgia will choose a majority of the election board. That election board, in turn, is empowered to take over up to 4 county election boards. So a state election board beholden to a Republican legislature could take over election operations in Atlanta's Fulton County, the most Democratic part of the state with the highest number of Black voters. In addition, in Georgia, a bunch of county election boards have dissolved now and formed new boards, which there are no Democrats on the board anymore. They are all Republican boards. So they could decide they don't want to certify local election results. The state election board could decide to sign off on not certifying these election results. The gerrymandered legislature could try to use more authority, for example, to try to appoint their own electors instead of the electors that are beholden to the will of the people in presidential elections. So there's a number of different ways this would work. In Texas, there was language that literally would have made it easier to overturn an election. It made it easier for candidates to petition judges to throw out election results, and it lowered the bar to being able to do that. Now, luckily, that law did not pass. They're starting a new special session tomorrow, but the hope is that that provision at least will not be in there anymore. Even Republicans were saying, we don't know how it got in there. Of course, they wrote the bill, so someone knows how it got in there. But I mean, this is, I think, the most chilling part. And, what I've been saying is, obviously it would be great if there was agreement across the board that all restrictions on voting are bad. But even if we can't agree on voter ID laws, or people have different ideas about how much time there should be to vote, or people have different ideas about the laws for mail balloting are, there should be no agreement that the will of the people should be followed in elections. And I think that should be an incontrovertible point. I think basically was an incontrovertible point until the last election. And that's what was new and so damaging. Not to say there weren't efforts to subvert the will of the voters, not to say that we don't have legal ways to subvert the will of the voters. That is what the Electoral College is, after all, the idea that you can, but I mean, there's a difference between institutionally being able to win an election through legal mechanisms, right? I mean, like it or not, everyone knows the rule of the Electoral College going in, to saying, we're just going to throw out votes after the fact. And so I think that's something that we really need more people to step up on, and we really need more Republicans to step up on and say, listen, I support voter ID. You know, I may have different ideas about mail voting, but I'm not going to implement steps that are going to overturn the will of the voters.
You know, it's bringing me back to, as we were watching the counting going on in those boards of elections, and also the threatening mobs that would show up and try to rattle, banging on windows and shouting about the election being stolen and voter fraud happening. It makes me think back to the 2000 election, right? When we had, you know, hanging chads all those years ago, and suddenly a mob outside the election office in Florida, as that federal election was being re-examined. That threat of violence and intimidation was really a part and parcel of this last election. And when paired with the January 6th uprising is quite frankly something that we haven't seen for a long time. It harkens back to the terrible days as Reconstruction was abandoned and we had such whole-scale intimidation going on and terrible violence at that time. I'm listening to all of this, and all of the people that are with us on Facebook Live and are participating on the Zoom are hearing this avalanche of bad news. So I want to pause here and I want to ask you, Ari, you are out there at the grassroots. Where are you seeing effective resistance to these state bills by grassroots activists, even if the efforts haven't won yet? Give us a snapshot of what you're seeing out there in Georgia, in Arizona, in Texas, with them coming in for that huge bill tomorrow. What's going on? Where's the resistance?
Well, I think the resistance has actually been pretty effective in that even if you don't win, a lot of the worst provisions did not become law. So Republicans at the beginning of the legislative session in Georgia, they wanted to repeal no excuse absentee voting. They wanted to get rid of automatic voter registration. They wanted to cut Sunday voting. They were unable to do all of those things. I mean, Republicans controlled every lever of government in Georgia, and they were unable to do those kind of things. So yes, the Georgia law does make it harder to vote, but at the same time, all of these key methods of voting are preserved and give people the ability to make their voices heard in future elections. Same thing in a number of other states. In Arizona, they've done a number of bad things, but a lot of the craziest bills didn't become law. Again, in a Republican-controlled legislature, because people made a big stink about bills that, for example, that would have given the legislature its authority to just appoint its own electors to override the will of the voters. Things like that didn't become law. In Texas, you saw them walk out and kill that bill in very dramatic fashion. And yes, it's coming back, but it's likely coming back without all of those bad provisions, and they're not going to be able to do it at 12 at night over Memorial Day weekend when everyone is trying to enjoy their holiday, as opposed to how they're going to try to have to do it now with lots more attention on it. And so, you know, I'm hopeful that there have been a lot of on the ground organizing efforts. I think people have done what they can to fight these bills. Now the federal government needs to step up. That's what's missing here. Republicans have used all of their levers of power to make it harder to vote, namely their control of the states and the control of the courts. What Democrats have is the federal government. We have not seen the same response from the federal government that we've seen from the states and from the courts. And yes, we saw the Justice Department sue Georgia, but the federal government has a tremendous amount of power to stop voter suppression. And at key moments in American history, the federal government, namely the Congress and the president, have stepped in. That's what Congress did after the Civil War. They stepped in, they passed the 14th and 15th Amendment to make sure that we would have Reconstruction. That's what happened in the 1960s. The Congress stepped in and passed the Voting Rights Act to prevent the kind of violence and intimidation that we saw throughout the Jim Crow South. And the Congress needs to step in once again. If that happens, I believe it will be a fair fight. But right now, one party is using all of the tools they have to unilaterally make it more difficult to vote. The other side is not using all of the tools they have to try to protect voting rights. And to me, that's the most frustrating part of this. That's the part of it that there's a lot of room to grow. There's a lot of things that have not been done yet. I know the president, the vice president, they're talking more about this issue. Democrats are going to bring back the For the People Act. They're going to vote on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But this can't be a vote that you lose the vote and you say, we're done. We're going to move on to anything else. If we have an infrastructure bill, if we build roads and bridges, but the infrastructure of our democracy collapses, it doesn't really amount to much. So I want to see more from our leaders in Washington around this. I believe they have the power to stop some, if not all, of these efforts. But it's a matter of, do they have the political will to do it? And I'm always reminded of this scene in January 1965, where Martin Luther King, who has just won the Nobel Peace Prize, goes to meet with Lyndon Johnson at the White House. And he talks to Lyndon Johnson and he says, I want you to pass the Voting Rights Act this year. And Lyndon Johnson says, I'm not going to do it. I just passed the Civil Rights Act. I've got a lot on my plate. I want to pass Medicare and all of these other things. I want to do infrastructure, just like Biden is saying right now. And Martin Luther King says, I'm going to Selma. I'm going to make you do it. And that's what we have to do right now. We have to go to Selma and make them do it. Because I don't believe that they're just going to do it on their own. It's very clear. Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, to some extent, members of the president and his team, they're okay doing other stuff, or nothing, as it were. Some of them are okay doing nothing. And nothing can't be an option. Something has to be an option. Now, it might not be everything, might not be the entire For the People Act, but I think there's general widespread agreement. Passing something is better than passing nothing. And passing something has to be the key thing that is emphasized over the next month here, because this is really critical in terms of make or break time. We are running out of time to protect American democracy. And how many more bad laws have to pass? How many more bad decisions have to come from the court? How much more weakened does the Voting Rights Act have to get before we recognize the severity of this crisis?
Ari, I think everyone on the call is cheering at this point as we've been working our tails off to pass the For the People Act. Many of us have already been advocating for the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, though it's expected to be introduced in September. We're hearing a lot of the politicians in Washington saying, well, maybe we'll just go for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, but not the For the People Act. But folks on this call really want to see those bills passed together. Both bills are needed. Of course, both bills also face surmounting, ending the filibuster. The groups that are co-sponsoring this program tonight have a variety of views on the filibuster. But right now we're looking at the For the People Act, which was just filibustered. The debate was filibustered. It's not, the bill's not dead, it's still there. But we realized to pass it, the filibuster has to be surmounted, reformed, or eliminated. Now the Workers' Circle is standing up, calling for the filibuster's elimination, noting that far from being an instrument of bipartisan debate and hearing minority voices, it's become an obstructionist tool, and it has a long and terrible racist history. Ari, how are you seeing the filibuster right now being used to entrench minority rule?
Well, I think we're seeing it all the time, because we are seeing bills that are supported by 70, 80% of Americans be killed by 41 Republican senators representing 21% of Americans. So the For the People Act was supported by 70% of the country, and a debate on it was blocked by a very, very small minority of Republicans that don't represent the diversity of the country. And I really think that the choice is between the filibuster or democracy right now. It's very clear that we can't have both, that we are not going to get legislation protecting voting rights if we keep the filibuster writ large. And at the very least, I think there has to be an exception to the filibuster and say, it's crazy that you can appoint a Supreme Court justice with 51 votes for life, but you can't pass legislation protecting voting rights with 51 votes. That doesn't make any kind of sense. Why can you pass a tax cut for the rich with 51 votes, but you can't expand voting rights for all Americans with 51 votes. There's no consistency here. It makes no sense why judges and budget bills can be done with a simple majority. But protecting the most fundamental right in a democracy cannot be done. It can only be done with a supermajority, especially as Republicans in the states are unilaterally making it harder to vote through a simple majority, one vote passages in many states. Whereas Democrats are saying we need all 60 votes in the Senate to do it. It doesn't make any sense. It's complete asymmetric warfare. And my argument to Joe Manchin, my argument to Kirsten Sinema was filibuster is not in the Constitution. It's an extra constitutional method that has evolved over time. Is that more important to you than protecting the most important right in a democracy? The right to vote is mentioned a lot of different times in the Constitution. We might not have an overall guarantee of voting rights, but we have protection from racial discrimination in voting. We have protection for women being able to vote. We have protections for 18-year-olds to be able to vote. There's lots of explicit protections in the Constitution for the right to vote. There is no explicit protection for the filibuster. So it's very clear, despite the ugly history of the filibuster, there is no constitutional argument for the filibuster. It was added in an ad hoc way. It's been lowered over the years. It's totally arbitrary. Why did it change from 2/3 to 60? Why can't it be changed to 55? Why can't you pass certain bills with 51 votes? And I think the other thing is we need to redefine what bipartisanship means in a few different ways. Number one, if a bill is supported by 70 to 80% of Americans, it's bipartisan whether or not Republicans in Congress support it. It has broad bipartisan support among the American people. Secondly, the filibuster is being used to prevent bipartisanship. In the January 6th commission vote, 54 people voted for that commission. It was blocked by 35 Republicans. So partisanship prevented bipartisanship. And so I think, listen, if there's a compromise for the People Act, and it seems like that's what's going to happen, some sort of deal is going to be cut between the Senate Democrats and Joe Manchin, then he should have that opportunity to take it around and see if he can get 60 votes for it. But I'm going to tell you right now, he's not going to get 61 votes for it. He's not going to get 60 votes. He's not going to get 51 votes for that bill. And even the John Lewis Voting Rights Act only has 51 votes. And so yes, bipartisanship is great, but these bills already are bipartisan. They already have bipartisan support among the public. And Democrats just need to do what Republicans in Georgia have done. That's my argument. Just do the same thing Republicans in Georgia did. Pass it with a simple majority. If the right to vote can be taken away with a simple majority, it absolutely should be expanded with a simple majority, because that's something that helps everybody. And this idea that if you're going to do automatic registration, if you're going to do no excuse absentee voting, if you're going to do election day registration, Democrats can win every election. Well, that would come as a surprise to Republicans in Iowa that have election day registration, or Republicans in Georgia that have no excuse absentee voting, or Republicans in Texas that have 2 weeks of early voting. I mean, the For the People Act is just taking policies that have already worked well in lots of different Republican-controlled states and putting them for federal elections in all 50 states. It's not radically invented things that haven't been tried. It's building on things that have already worked well in both red and blue places.
I'm going to remind all of you who are with us on Zoom and on Facebook Live, we're going to be turning to questions from all of you momentarily. Before we do that, it would be remiss of me if we didn't focus in a bit on the Supreme Court's recent 6-3 decision in Brnovich v. DNC. We have with us tonight Ari Berman, who literally wrote the book on the Voting Rights Act called Give Us the Ballot. And by the way, a preview at the end of our program tonight, we're going to be giving away 5 copies in a raffle to those of you who have come and participated in this wonderful program with Ari. So Ari, in 2013, the Supreme Court Shelby v. Holder eviscerated Article 5 of the Voting Rights Act, literally removing federal oversight from those states with long histories of voter suppression, and no longer requiring those states to go to the federal government and have any changes to proposed voting laws pre-cleared, pre-approved before proceeding. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, may her memory be a blessing, said it was like throwing out pre-clearance was like throwing out your umbrella because you're not getting wet. In other words, the VRA was working. It got sliced and diced. The late Congressman John Lewis of blessed memory said, "This is a stake in the heart of the VRA." 8 years ago, some of us took cold comfort in the fact that the court wasn't eviscerating Article 2, that there still was a means to bring suits that said there's been racial discrimination here and have a process to bring that forward. But last week, that article was weakened. Ari, is the Voting Rights Act effectively dead?
Well, it's not dead, but it's very much on life support. And for those of you that have read my book, this will not be a surprise because I have lots in it about how John Roberts, when he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department back in the 1980s, led the effort to try to weaken Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. This has been a 50-year crusade for people like John Roberts. And this was just an amazing bait and switch that they did, which is they gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act. And they said, oh, by the way, you'll still have these other parts of the Voting Rights Act. And then what did they do? Of course, they then weakened those parts of the Voting Rights Act as well. And this was completely, we saw this coming from a mile away, that they were going to do this, that all along they wanted to kill the entirety of the Voting Rights Act. I don't believe that they ever liked the Voting Rights Act, and they have been trying to get rid of it in so many kind of different ways. On the one hand, this is an incredibly radical, ahistorical decision where the court has basically just written entirely new tests for the VRA that are completely at odds with what Congress did in the 1980s. At the same time, it doesn't change a whole lot because I was not expecting this court to try to go against the voting restrictions that have been introduced already. It was already clear to me that things in Georgia, things in Arizona, things in Florida were going to get the green light from the Roberts Court eventually. So yes, it's very startling that they've weakened the Voting Rights Act, but they were going to weaken it in some form or another. And again, I think it just underscores the need for federal action. In 1980, the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act. And you had people like John Roberts in the Reagan administration who wanted to keep that weak decision by the Supreme Court. The Congress overruled them. The Congress wrote a stronger Voting Rights Act, and the Congress can once again write a stronger Voting Rights Act right now. So again, this should be a wake-up call to people that stop relying on the courts. I mean, I hear all the time, we filed this lawsuit, we filed that lawsuit. That's great. I think we absolutely have to litigate these things. That's a critical tool. Maybe you'll win in the federal courts. Maybe in some states you'll win in the state courts. But I never believed that you were going to be able to litigate your way out of this. This ultimately needs a political solution. And it needs a political solution in terms of action by the Congress, action by a president, and also it needs a political solution in getting better people on it to pass voting rights in the first place, so that we don't rely on Sam Alito or we don't rely on John Roberts to try to protect the right to vote, because ultimately that's a losing proposition. So it was a very disturbing decision, but at the same time, it just underscores the need to try to combat this through other avenues instead of the courts, or instead of at least the federal courts.
Thank you, Ari. Our Q&A is lighting up with lots of questions. Let me turn to one of them. Pat Butler writes in and says, hey, are these new voter suppression laws subject to legal challenges? If so, how likely are they to be overturned given what's just happened with the courts?
Well, so I think Samuel Alito made it pretty clear that he's going to be okay with most of the restrictions on voting that have been enacted recently. So I would not hold your breath waiting for this Supreme Court to strike down the kind of restrictions on voting that we're seeing. I hope I'm proven wrong, but I think reading that opinion, it's pretty clear. That said, there are other avenues to challenge these kind of things. There are abilities to challenge things in state courts. There are a number of states that have more progressive courts than the Supreme Court. Supreme Courts in Pennsylvania, Supreme Courts in North Carolina, Supreme Courts in Michigan are much more progressive than the US Supreme Court. That is one avenue to try to challenge these things. Maybe you don't strike down all of the laws, but maybe you strike down some of them. Maybe the lawsuits don't succeed, but they mobilize people to get out and vote. They inform people of what the laws do, how to try to combat them. Litigation works in a lot of different ways. Sometimes you can lose the case, but win the battle. And I think that could be an outcome here where this can spur a kind of backlash. And so I hope that the Justice Department, other groups keep filing these kind of lawsuits. I think you have to try to win on the merits. But again, it was very, very difficult to win voting rights suits in 1963 and 1964 before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And you heard Merrick Garland say, we need help from the Congress. I think that message has only been strengthened since that Arizona decision, that we can hire all the best lawyers in the world. If we don't have strong protections under the law, and by the way, being interpreted by judges who have a very restrictive view of the law, then it's going to be very hard for us to win these cases, despite how good the cases might be.
So Ari, there's an anonymous attendee who sent in a very interesting question. Aren't these state laws likely to depress the votes of Republicans as well?
They very well could, because, like I said, before 2020, Republicans were voting by mail in large numbers in places like Florida. And Republicans are benefiting from things like early voting and things like election day registration too. And that's why not every Republican strategist, not every Republican has been on board with these kind of efforts. So they absolutely could affect Republicans. I mean, listen, the Jim Crow laws disenfranchise a lot of white people too. But they were willing to accept that kind of collateral damage. And I think that's the argument right now is, yes, there will be a collateral damage, but I think there's just generally speaking a thought that when turnout is lower, one party benefits. Again, I'm not necessarily sure that's true, but that clearly I think seems to be the rationale behind this. But I do believe there will be collateral damage. And I think some of these laws in their haste to be passed were not very well thought through.
We got a question both from Facebook Live and from one of our participants, Adrian Wilbur, asking about your view on DC statehood and how that would affect elections. In S1, of course, is the promise of DC statehood. There's also the standalone bill. Ari, talk to us about DC statehood.
I think DC statehood is critically important because the US Senate is so unrepresentative of the country. Right now, the US Senate is way wider, more rural and more conservative than the country as a whole. And so DC statehood wouldn't fix all of that, but it would start to swing the pendulum in another direction. Also, you only need 51 votes to change the filibuster. That's the interesting thing here. You only need a simple majority to change a 60-vote supermajority. So if you had 2 senators from DC, you wouldn't have to be talking about Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema all day, because there would be 51 votes or close to 51 votes to changing the filibuster. So I think it would be very helpful in a lot of different ways. It's long overdue. It's clear that there's a huge racial dynamic to the fact that Vermont and Wyoming, which have fewer people than DC and are almost entirely white, are states, and DC is not a state. I think it's very clear that the fact there's such a large Black population in DC is why so many Republicans oppose DC statehood. And I think that in general, we need more focus on structural reforms. We need more focus on DC statehood. We need more focus on trying to do something about the Electoral College, trying to do something about the structure of the Senate rules. So these voting bills, to me, they're only the first step in the kind of changes we need, that we need to go much further in terms of all of the structural problems in our democracy.
I'm seeing that there's a lot of people inspired in the chat, in the Q&A. I would go to Selma, Paula Montgomery says, tell me where to go. Well, Paula, there's some good news. We're in a week called Deadline for Democracy right now, and there is an all-out push in the month of July to activate people across the country to call on our senators to pass the For the People Act and not let the filibuster stand in the way. There are many in-person events happening. There are also opportunities on the anniversary of John Lewis's passing that are coming up on July 17th. There's going to be a big voting rights march at the end of August. What I do want to say to all of you who are watching is, if you've registered for this Zoom, please know that we will keep you posted from the Workers' Circle on various opportunities for you to plug in, including ongoing Tuesday night phone banks and more. So there is much to do. Our co-sponsors of this program also are running phone banks, are organizing events. So feel free to check out the good work that they're doing. I'm seeing another question on this that has to do with why can't voter protection provisions from S1 be amended into the John Lewis Act? It's sort of a, why aren't those two things put together? Ari, can you tell us a little more about that?
I suppose they could be, but the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is meant to address a very specific issue, which is the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act. And I think every expectation is that will be litigated the minute it is passed, because it directly deals with a Supreme Court case that was recently decided. So they are moving slowly because they want to build a record in favor of why the Voting Rights Act needs to be protected, that will stand up in front of the Supreme Court. Now, I believe the Supreme Court's going to do whatever it wants to do. So I believe passing this thing quickly and being able to counteract some of these voter suppression bills is better than passing it slowly, thinking you're insulating it from the court and the court striking it down anyway, because they clearly have it in for the Voting Rights Act in the first place. That said, John Roberts did explicitly say in the Shelby County decision, Congress can draft a more current Voting Rights Act, which is exactly what Congress is doing. But they're two different things in that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act revives a specific section of the Supreme Court and only applies to certain places. The For the People Act applies equally to all 50 states for federal elections under different authority of the Congress's ability to set rules for federal elections. That is different than the authority under which Congress would restore the Voting Rights Act. So these bills were always meant to work in tandem. And that's why the either or approach is really wrong, because the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is going to stop the worst states from doing future voter suppression, but it will not roll back the voter suppression laws already passed, nor will it expand voting rights in the way that the For the People Act would do. So maybe at the end of the day, they could be put together, but I understand the strategy of not doing it, because one bill was intended to solve one problem, the other bill is intended to solve another problem. I believe now that the Congress will also have to respond to the Supreme Court's decision on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act as well. I would expect that language to be added to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act when it's introduced.
Ari, you've been researching and reporting on voting rights. You've been watching all of this unfold. What's inspired you? What have you seen that's reminded you of the power of we the people to stand against anti-democratic forces in our nation?
I think what's just inspired me, historically, has been, the courage of people like John Lewis and the courage of people like the civil rights movement. And they didn't wait for anyone to give them their rights. They demanded their rights. And I think that's always really important to note, that they did not have positions of power. They were not well liked by people in authority, but they built a movement to make those rights impossible to ignore. And so I think that's a really, really useful lesson in American history. And what also just inspired me was just the incredible level of engagement in 2020, that so many people did so much work to make sure that people would be able to vote. And it was incredibly successful. The fact that 700,000 people volunteered as poll watchers, the fact that we had the highest turnout in 120 years, the fact that there was so much civic engagement around voting, that sports teams lent their arenas to be polling sites. Really, we're all kind of in this together. And I think the work of 2021 has to be to sustain the progress that was made in 2020, that we did an incredible job of making sure that people were able to vote and had their votes counted. And now we have to make sure that people have those same protections going forward, and that high turnout, making the process as convenient as possible, making it so that we have leaders that reflect the diversity of our society. That should be the new normal, as opposed to making efforts to make it harder to vote, the new normal. And really, it could go either way right now. It's not clear that one side has won over the other, but it's clear that the forces of retrenchment are trying as hard as they can to win where they failed in the last election. And so we just have to do everything that we can to make sure that doesn't happen, because it's not about who wins. It's not ultimately about which party wins. It's about the fact that, are we going to allow the anti-democratic forces to take over American democracy so that we no longer have a democracy that we recognize? This is bigger about This is bigger than one party. This is bigger than one election. This is about whether you can, in essence, overthrow the democratic process itself. And so that's why I think this historical moment is so important. And that's why I think that our leaders, particularly our senators, have to understand the urgency of the moment. They're not just debating one voting rights bill. They're not just talking about one piece of legislation. They're talking about the preservation of American democracy. And if they can't do that, if they can't defend American democracy, what are they there for?
Ari, you've given us so much to think about, and we are getting ready at the end of our conversation with you to turn to do just that. So to everybody who is on the Zoom call and on Facebook Live, in just a moment at 8 o'clock, we're going to turn and we're going to make some calls to our senators. And all you DC people out there without your senators, why don't you give a call to Senator Schumer, the majority leader, and remind him about the importance of DC statehood while you're at it. He has some unique power to set this debate up right. And so we're going to be turning to that in just a moment. Ari, I want to thank you so much on behalf of all of the groups who have co-sponsored this program tonight for being the articulate and inspiring journalist you are. You help us see more clearly. You give us the details as well as a framework for thinking about it. I don't know about everybody else on this call, but from what I'm seeing in the Q&A right now, we're raring to go, and we're going to keep up this action, keep up this fight for our very democracy. We know that now it's up to us. We, the people, need to give a strong message to Congress, and we're certainly going to do so. Ari, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We look forward to having you back another time, hopefully with some good news that will get the For the People Act passed and will start this country moving in a better direction. Thank you so much.
Noelle, thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone who was on this call. And thank you for all the work you've done. And please keep it up and stay well. Thank you.
Take care. Friends, I want to announce that there are 5 winners of our raffle. And these 5 wonderful participants who've been with us are going to receive a free copy of Ari Berman's book, Give Us the Ballot. Our raffle winners are Sheila Katz, Shelley Katz, Doris Shapira, Deborah McGee, Roxy Kessler, and Nick Michelli. Well, you lucky, wonderful people, thanks for being with us. And now without further ado, let's get calling to our senators. We've heard what's at stake. It's our democracy's at stake. And Ari has helped set the stage. I want to introduce to you now the Workers' Circle social justice organizer, Jonathan Talbus. And Jonathan's going to take us through a very straightforward call-in to the Senate. Jonathan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Noelle. I just want to say how great it is to be here on this call with hundreds of activists across the country, to be able to learn so much from Ari Berman. Really, I'm feeling inspired, I'm feeling motivated, and I know that now is the time for us to redouble our efforts in the fight for voting rights and for basic democratic values, frankly, because that is what's on the line. But now that we've heard about the stakes of the issues and we're armed with the knowledge of what's happening, the next step, as Noelle mentioned, is for us to get activated. We're going to take some action together. We're going to make some calls, and we are going to let our elected officials know tonight that they need to act. They need to stand up for democracy. They need to protect and preserve voting rights and combat voter suppression by passing the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And all you need to do in order to let them know is use your phone. Now, on the screen in front of you, you should be able to see the Senate switchboard hotline. Now, we're going to be calling our senators who are on recess right now, but who are all, there you go. Now you should be able to see it. Our senators who are on recess right now, but every single one of them are receiving and keeping up with voicemails. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to invite you to call the number on the screen. You'll be connected to either an operator or an automated voice operator. When you're connected, if you know your senator's name, please choose one. So I'm from New York, And I might say, I'd like to speak with Senator Schumer, and they'll connect you straight through. If you get an automated voice that answers, you can say, I'd like to speak to the senators from New York, in which case they will give you both options. In my case, they would say, would you like to speak to Senator Schumer or Senator Gillibrand? And even if you don't know your senators' names, don't sweat it, not a problem. Either the operator or the automated operator will tell you and connect you through, easy. Once you reach their office, they're able to take very high volumes of voicemails. So do not worry at all that we're calling in at the same time. Finally, before we get calling, let me just take you through a quick example of a voice message to show you how it'll go. So you'll say, hello, my name is, and since my name is Jonathan Taubes, I would say, my name is Jonathan Taubes. I live in Brooklyn, New York. My zip code is 11225. Senator Schumer, I am calling to urge you to stand up for democracy and for every American's right to vote by supporting the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act when it's introduced. We cannot let the filibuster stand in the way of ensuring that every American has the right to cast their vote and have it counted. With hundreds of bills to restrict voting rights in state legislatures and the Supreme Court's decision last week to weaken the Voting Rights Act, Congress must act. Voter suppression has no place in our democracy. I urge your support for the For the People Act and for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and I am counting on you because democracy can't wait. I'd love to hear from you. Give me a call at, and here's where, if you'd like to add in your number, just put your telephone number there. So it is really that simple. And while this script is on the screen right now, I invite you to dial that number and let's get those calls going. We'll be standing by with a little bit of soft music. And once you've left a message, please come on back to the chat over here. Let us know you've left a message for your senator, or even for both senators if you're able. I know I'm going to try to call both. And we'll just stay on the Zoom for a couple more minutes while you're making these calls. And we would so appreciate being able to see this collective action unfold in real time of who and where folks are calling. So without further ado, let's do this, everyone. Let's start making some calls. Hey everyone, I was just able to leave 2 short calls for Senator Schumer and Gillibrand. And I see in the chat another call for Senator Schumer. Would be very curious for some people outside New York City, though of course we love New York City as well. Once again, just encouraging folks to please drop who they've reached into the chat. We would really so love to see who folks are calling. And we've got someone from Massachusetts who's left a call for Senator Markey. It is so wonderful that we have close to 100 people still on the call, making calls. Please keep it up. And by the way, that doesn't count people who are watching on Facebook Live. Senator Rich of Idaho. So we've got some Idaho representation there. And I know that there were some people who mentioned in the chat as well, in the Q&A, and someone called Sylvia called Senators Rubio and Scott. And then Myra reached the offices of both North Carolina senators. So I'm so glad to see representation from around the country. Thank you so much, everyone. We're just about ready to wrap up. So I want to thank you all for joining the Workers' Circle tonight for Live from the Front Lines of the Fight for Voting Rights with Ari Berman. I'd like to thank all our participants for taking the time to learn with us and to make calls. Just a heads up, we're going to keep the call list on the call script open just for a couple minutes. If folks want to finish up, we really encourage you to if you're still in the middle. I would like to thank all our many fantastic co-sponsors for your support and your promotion of this program. And because this fight is very much ongoing, I'd like to invite you all to join the Workers' Circle in our continued activism for voting rights and for social justice. Please, I encourage you to visit our website at circle.org to learn more. We look forward to standing shoulder to shoulder with you as we continue to fight to protect and strengthen our democracy. Thank you very much and have a good night.